Hi, I'm Milan, and welcome to today's podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about managers that expect you to work 24/7 and be on Slack, or they text you, or they even call you with no real boundaries about work life balance or expectations. We're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with it, some of the things that drive managers and individual contributors to actually work that way, along with some strategies on how to effectively set expectations so you can reclaim your nights and your weekends like I've had to do. Again, my name is Milan. In the 30 years I spent working my way to senior level in a Fortune 100 company, I had my own share of managers that used to do this and expect this of me. And I think the biggest challenge here is really around understanding what causes this, because I think there are some factors that if you understand what drives your manager, or you as a manager to actually do this, we can effectively have the kind of workplace that we all want to be in, where we can have time to recharge and do have the work-life balance that we want. Now, I will state that with the new hybrid work environment that came since COVID, that does change the tenor a little bit and how it actually works, because in reality, we don't really have the same like 9 to 5 work life. So sometimes, people flex their schedules. So we'll also talk a little bit about what does it mean to kind of manage our own lives in these new environmental ways that managers and individual contributors want to work, and how they want to manage their lives. So before we start talking about it, I do want to set a couple of ground rule expectations. For example, in most salary jobs, there are things that are known as push times. You have a big release coming up, or you're getting a new product out, and as you get close to the schedule, I think it's kind of understood that crap happens, and no matter how well that you plan, there are going to be some valid times to actually work longer than a normal day, or even on the weekends a little bit. And we'll also talk about the fact that this is stemming from a systemic need to work 24/7, not if you want to work on your own time on the weekends in order to advance your career or learn new skills. We're talking where the expectation is really for your day-to-day job that you have to work nights and weekends, or at least be available 24/7. And why that's not really good for anybody's mental health or just for their ability to recharge. So before we start going into it, let's talk a little bit about, from a manager perspective, why do managers do this? I've been a manager for a very long time, managing a medium to larger size team. And what I can tell you is there are some real, I think, obvious drivers on why some managers feel they have to be on and they're always working 24/7. So some of the things I've observed and experienced myself throughout the years is, one, they can be overwhelmed. And by overwhelmed, sometimes they take on some new responsibilities and they're trying to ramp up and understand what's happening. And there's just a lot of new workload that, if you think about what their normal 8-hour day was, or in 40-hour week, let's say that you take a manager and then you've tripled the size of their team or even doubled it. So if you think about from a manager perspective, the tools that they used to manage their time have to change. And a lot of times managers are not equipped to immediately change their tactics and how they manage their time. Like, for example, if you are using, say, so many hours a week for one-on-ones and you've doubled your number of directs, and you plan on that other time being filled in doing email and meetings, well, you can't double the number of your directs and have the same number of one-on-ones without needing more time. And I think that's where a lot of managers don't understand that you have to change your tactics and how you manage your team. Because if you try to brute force it, just throwing hours at the situation, what ends up happening is then that's going to bleed into the manager's nights and weekends, and therefore they're going to be trying to catch up on this new work. They're going to have to send more emails out because they can't get to them during that time. And then it snowballs to the entire team in terms of expectations. And that's not a healthy place to be in, either from a manager perspective or as an individual contributor who's on the receiving end of that. So that's like the one that I've noticed the most, particularly after reorgs, and especially if a manager's getting reorged into a larger role, something they haven't dealt with before and developed those tools. It's something that individual contributors can actually help their managers with. Now, in this case, managers do need to learn how to delegate more and pull themselves out of the day-to-day tactics. You cannot physically spend the time doing everything you were doing before and be successful if your team doubles, if you're going to operate the same way. And I think a lot of managers think they can. And I know early in my career, I felt the same pressure, feeling that I can just do what I'm doing, just throw more time at it. But I didn't realize how that impacted the individual contributors and the team members that worked for me. It really did take more of their time to do that. So being overwhelmed is something that managers have to deal with new tools with. And especially if you're an individual contributor, you can notice this happening to your manager if they've taken on a larger team. And that's something you can help them with. You can go to the manager and say, hey, how do I help you scale more? What can I take off your plate that you don't need to worry about? What are the few things that you do need to worry about because I can't read your mind? So what are those things that I can help you with? So one is to approach your manager and ask them how you can help them to not be so overwhelmed. The next one is a little harder to manage as an individual contributor. And that is some managers and leaders, I hate to say this, they're flat out micromanagers. They really do believe that they need to have their finger on the pulse of everything that happens in the organization. That usually happens when they feel an unhealthy amount of accountability for every little action. That is a hard thing for managers to grow through. When you're accountable, sometimes you feel like you have to know every detail of everything that happens. And I've seen this even at more senior levels, that because they have to micromanage, they want to read every email that comes in. They feel this level of, I hate to say this, but mistrust about what happens underneath them because they feel they have to decide everything. Now that's goes into a much longer conversation about empowerment and scaling. But that is how you can notice it, is if they have to read every little detail for something that's so far below their level that they should care about, is it's micromanaging. So that one is one that you can kind of be aware of that it's happening. You can kind of see the implications of it. And I've got a great example of this. I was working with a senior person one time, and they came back from a short business travel trip, and they said, oh, I don't know, I'm going to have to be working all weekend. I got over 300 emails to get through. First thing I thought to myself was, if a senior leader has to catch up on 300 emails, then they are not empowering their team to be leaders themselves, either as individual contributors or as managers if they're managing other people. Because there's no reason why a senior leader should have to go through 300 emails after a very short business trip. That just means that you don't trust the people underneath you to make decisions. And I know that's hard for some managers to hear, but it's true. Part of being a great leader is empowering your team to make a lot of decisions and become more of an arbitrator versus a manager, which is a whole separate topic in itself. But the point is, if you have to read that many emails as a leader, even if you're taking over a larger team, then you have to be much more cognizant of where you spend your time. And if you're noticing a manager doing this, or you're doing this yourself, you should really reevaluate how you're empowering your team to be successful. Then there's another one for managers, which is really ego. And the ego is I'm smarter and I can just do the job better, and I'm accountable, so I'm going to do it for you. And that kind of goes in with the micromanagement, but they really feel that the people underneath them, whether it's due to a lack of experience or just the fact they may not have the exact same skill set as the leader has, they feel they can do the job better. And that's a hard one because that doesn't allow your team to actually grow and learn to make mistakes. Now, coaching them in the right direction is good. And I have to be honest with you, this is an area that I've struggled with because I've done a lot of things my team hasn't done before. And so when that happens, then I don't want them to step on landmines that I know that I hit in the past when I know they can be avoided. And so there is a balance to be had in there about how far do you allow that level of empowerment and learning, which may come with some failure. And that is one that you really want to be cognizant of, because if you really try to go in and try to make everything perfect, again, the hours in the day don't add up, and that's going to require other people to work nights and weekends. And some managers, on the last point, is they just can't let it go. They feel they have to know everything. So they're reading mail, they're asking a ton of questions. And this comes with particularly detailed-oriented people or data-driven people that really are in the weeds, and they like to be in the weeds, and they like to know everything going on in every project. But again, it doesn't scale. And as a manager, it's really hard sometimes to step out of that. And I'll have a great example for myself. I remember I started a new job with a completely different team, and I was pretty senior at the time. And after 5 months or 6 months, I was going on my first vacation. It was like 2 weeks. And I'll never forget my manager asking me, so you're going to be on vacation. How many times a day are you going to be checking your email and answering? And I kind of chuckled and I said, I'm sorry. And I literally did chuckle. I said, I am not working remotely. I'm actually going on vacation. I put so-and-so in charge. And of course, I'll pick up the phone if it's an emergency. So part of that example is really to highlight that you can set expectations, though I could tell it was a little uncomfortable because I expected senior people to be available. And I said, I am, just not for day-to-day issues. One, it allows me to put somebody in charge who can actually learn by having the chair, as we say, maybe making some decisions. And what's the worst that can happen in 2 weeks? If it's really bad and somebody's stuck, they know they can pick up the phone and call me. But it's really about setting expectations about what is urgent and important versus what's just a day-to-day function. So that's kind of some of the manager mindset of how you can identify if you're an IC or a manager in yourself if you find yourself working nights and weekends and not feeling you can get ahead. So let's switch that down to an individual contributor perspective about why they actually do it. And I think it's important to understand the mindset before we start talking a little bit about some strategies to kind of deal with it. So as an individual contributor, when I've noticed this, even for myself, I found that most items that happen over a weekend, most of them, if not all of them, are really not critical. And so what I mean by that is when I see something over a weekend, because sometimes I have to do specific items on the weekend, or I'd have to do it because internationally people are working on a Sunday because that's their Monday. And what I can say is most of them are not critical. And what I mean by critical is the question to ask yourself is really around, if I did not answer this till Monday, what would fail? What's the impact to the business? And in most cases, there probably isn't one. Now, if it's an operations job or a crit sit, and that's your job to answer those on weekends, again, that's out of bounds. We're talking about a job that day-to-day does not require weekend coverage or even night coverage. What can happen if it doesn't wait till the next day? And I think that's an important question to ask yourself, whether you're a manager or an individual contributor, whether you're thinking of sending that mail or you happen to check, which we'll get to in a minute, and you see it, and you're like, well, should I answer it because my manager's sending the mail on a Saturday? The question is really, what's the business impact if you don't answer it until Monday? Because in most cases, it's not going to have any impact at all. So the other item from an individual contributor is somewhat fear-based, meaning, oh, my manager's working the weekend. If I don't work the manager, they're going to see that I'm not dedicated. I don't think that's true, but I know that unfortunately, the manager usually sets the tone. And so when you have a manager that does that, I know it can be difficult, especially if it's a new manager for you, whether you've been reorged or you took a new job, to really understand what the dynamics of expectations are. And while we'll get to that in a minute, I think that understanding if you're feeling that apprehension or uncomfortableness by not answering that mail, if you happen to see it on a weekend or late at night, think about what the business impact is and whether or not it would be critical or make any impact, whether or not you answered it now or later. And then the last one goes back to the same one for managers, which is ego, and you can't let it go, and you have to know all the details. And that is unfortunately kind of a personality thing that you have to work out in yourself, saying, can you let it go? Can you actually separate yourself? Now, what I'll tell you is I've noticed with a lot of the younger generation, they're much better than I think some of us that are older, like I'm a Gen Xer, in terms of understanding the dynamic and what you prioritize for yourself. But I do think it can happen to anyone individually, but being able to shut off is a very important skill and thing that you need to do if you really want to reclaim your weekends and your nights where you can when you can recharge and unplug and then actually have time off. Okay, so we've kind of gone through a bit of the manager and IC mindset. So let's talk some strategies about how to deal with it. And I'm actually going to start with the individual contributor first. So as an IC, one of the important things to think about is how do you set expectations with your manager about what your normal, I'll call them response hours are. And, we talked earlier a little bit about how it can get a little murky, re- because with the new hybrid work environment, it can be somewhat challenging to understand whose hours are what. And I think the most important thing here is expectation setting. Now, I can tell you, even though I was a manager, but as an IC, when I used to go on vacation, especially for 2 weeks, I was in kind of an operational job, but I wanted to separate out kind of time to recharge while on vacation. So setting expectations I found is extremely important. And one of the tactics I used was in my email when I was gone for more than a week, because I used to get, hundreds of emails a day. I would literally put a line at the top of my out of office auto mailer that said, on vacation during these days, due to the amount of email I get, I will not be reviewing any email that comes in during this period, which is my vacation period. If it's urgent, please contact so-and-so below, one of the professionals who can help you, and they know how to contact me in case of an emergency. Something to that effect. But what that did actually was let people know not to expect an answer, so they would go to the team. And when the team then, or whoever I had answering mails for me on issues, had an issue, and if it was urgent enough and they couldn't answer it, then they might contact me, but my customers or the other people working with me would not expect a response. And the same thing can be done with your manager if you're an individual contributor. You can say, look, I happen to notice by chance this email came in at 9 p.m. and it kind of looked like you're waiting for an answer, but just so we're clear, I usually have my phone and email off. I have family time, during this period. On weekends, I tend not to check. You can call me or text me if it's an absolute emergency. And that can work a lot of wonders as an individual contributor with your manager, particularly if your manager flexes hours themselves. Like the manager might be out late afternoon to pick up children or attend events, and then they get back on in the evening. But if you don't tell them you're not available, how are they going to know? Because again, they don't have a crystal ball. They can't read minds. And I find that a lot of employees are somewhat reluctant to talk about what their normal operating hours are and when managers can expect responses versus a true emergency that they would probably pick up the phone for. So the other thing, other than availability to speak about with your manager, is what constitutes an emergency? And I think this one obviously is a gray area based on the business that you're in. But what I found is that sometimes the manager and employee don't agree on what an emergency is. I mean, I've had managers call me with a question. And the question, again, going back to that, if I did this on Monday, would it impact the business negatively versus answering it on the weekend? And again, in most cases, the answer is probably no. And sometimes that takes a bit of negotiation with your manager about what the guidelines are for an emergency. A lot of times it's pretty self-evident where it's pretty easy to determine if an issue is business critical. Say a customer's trying to close a deal on Sunday because it's Monday in Europe and you need an answer. Well, you should tell your manager, well, you need to tell me that because otherwise I may, I don't want to be called unless it's something that really has to close that day. If it can wait till Monday, I prefer to do that because I want to recharge. So I think that expectation setting is something that a lot of people have to get comfortable with your manager. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some hard blocks. And one of those is shut off the email on your phone. I mean, I know it sounds kind of simple because a lot of people tie their personal email with the regular like Outlook if they're using that and you get both, but you have to shut it off. Like if you're going to actually look at it, that's on you. And I think that a big part of learned behavior is practicing it. And sometimes it can be hard if you're trying to break yourself of this habit of always having to know what's going on. Then you have to shut off the email and just not look at it. And I know that can be difficult and challenging, but it goes back to if your boss has an emergency and they know they can text you, well, then you can always get on mail. So one of the examples I use on that is I used to go on vacation. When I went on vacation, I would take my laptop. But I used to tell my team, look, I'm only taking the laptop while I'm on vacation for emergencies. I have to sign certain paperwork that only I can sign, a little bit easier to read on the computer versus my phone. And so I will take the computer, but I'm not really checking email. Now, if it's critical and there's a critical email that I really have to answer, then you need to text me and tell me that there's this email I need to go read because I'm only going to go read that one. And then I'll read that one, answer it, and then obviously resolve a critical issue. But again, that comes with the shutting down the apps. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with because if you can't really shut them down, it can be very challenging to not go in and then actually look at the email when that is something you're used to doing. So that's what you can do as an individual contributor to try to mitigate the night and weekend work. So let's talk about the manager again, because I think the manager does things that sets bad behavior and also things they can do themselves in order to unplug. So everything I talked about for an individual contributor, I used as a manager as well, at being an individual contributor to my manager above me. So I followed all the same things. I set the right expectations. I kind of looked at the ground rules for emergencies, and we talked about what vacation means and my quiet time on the weekends. So all of that notwithstanding, I think managers a lot of times really don't understand the impact that their actions have on their teams. I happen to know, like, there's a team I worked with recently, went through a reorg, and the new manager was a self-proclaimed bad steward of nights and weekends. They did email a lot on nights and on weekends, always working. And so the new team members who weren't used to this came to me on the side and said, "Hey, do I have to start answering these emails and work at the weekend?" And I said, well, that's a choice you have to make for yourself. Nobody can make that choice for you. And I think the challenge with that is you have to have the fortitude to really be able to set those limits. Because if you don't set those limits, what ends up happening is you're going to have a hard conversation, whether you have it early on about setting the limits and making sure that you both are fully aligned with what night and weekend contact might look like so you can unplug, or later when you don't do it and you're working nights and weekends, then you have a hard conversation that you set this expectation that you're going to answer. Now the manager thinks that is your normal work and that you're okay with that. But that comes from not being clear between both of you about what the expectation is. So managers, I have to tell you, do not send email on weekends or nights. Be your own good steward of what constitutes a critical email. I personally have experimented with, hey, I have a lot of emails. Sometimes I'm catching up and I'll put the delay on it so it doesn't send it till 8 a.m. and then a flood of them goes out. I personally didn't have a lot of luck with that. I know some managers that do that, and they'll write the emails at night, but none of them, they set them to go out at 8 a.m. the next morning. I don't know. Sometimes I forget to set it, and it goes out. And I prefer just to leave them in draft mode. And then in the morning, if I happen to be working to catch up, I can send them all out in the morning. And, like I said, I think that there are cases where some people want to work more than nights and weekends. We'll get to that in a moment. But again, as a manager, you really have to take a look at that and not send the emails out on the weekend. The second one is you got to stop micromanaging. I mean, as a manager, I know it can be hard, but as you scale up, you cannot spend the amount of time on each individual issue. And it's one of the big fallbacks I've seen on growing managers, even some senior ones, who really are micromanagers at heart. They want to know every detail. They want to be part of every decision. And so they have to read those 300 emails and those long threads versus really coaching your team through it and guiding them through making decisions. They really do need to understand every detail. And that is something as managers you have to break, especially as your team scale. The problem is if you don't do it, your team never actually grows to take over those responsibilities. So it's a process, to be sure. But if you think about it, say, look, your team is used to you managing and micromanaging at a certain level. You double the size of your team. You pull back half the time you spend with them dealing on issues. That's pretty risky because they're used to having you in those, making more decisions, maybe being able to bounce more ideas off of, and you just don't have the time. So managers, you really have to back off and really start having your team and your managers treat you as arbitrators and not as managers. An arbitrator is somebody that they come to help you make a good decision, but they've already done most of the work. They might have to choose between option A and option B. There's different pros and cons. They have a recommendation. There might be some details they don't know, but you don't have to know all the underlying details to help them make a good decision. There is some risk to that. And managers, especially those that deal with egos and the fact that they think they can do it better than everybody that works for them, sometimes you have to weigh that out and really take a step back and allow the team to make decisions. Sometimes they'll make some ones that they will learn from, that they won't go perfect. But the only way you're going to be able to scale and then move yourself out of this need to look at everything, which then goes to time, is going to be to back away. And as I would suggest you take baby steps with that, particularly with your more senior managers. If it feels uncomfortable as a manager to tell the person, yep, you make the decision, then you're probably doing something right. You want to start changing your questions to, how is that outcome going to impact the business? Let them make the decision. And while you may or may not agree, you might offer some pros and cons, but you have to get out of reading every email and understanding every detail. Otherwise, you won't scale and you'll be working nights and weekends, which will force you to send more email nights and weekends to your team. And they're going to feel the pressure to have to keep up with you. So the other thing that you really want to keep in mind as an individual contributor or manager, and this is what Dr. Phil says, actually, my wife always has me watch Dr. Phil when she thinks it might improve me, is that you teach people how to treat you. And I think this is the one where the younger generation, especially Gen Z, is really figuring out what it means to say, look, these are my work hours and this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do more than that now because I want to have a life. And I think that's great. But what I will say is that when you do that, make sure your manager kind of agrees that fits within the profile of your job. Now, there's one case that I talked about, working nights and weekends, where you can do it, I won't say proactively, but you do it knowingly. And what I can tell you is some people really want to advance their careers. And when I talk about working nights and weekends, I usually say you shouldn't be forced to do it. Like, it shouldn't be part of your job description to do it. Now, as an individual contributor, there were many years where I decided to work on Sundays because I was working on special projects that were interesting to me. I was growing skills. So all of this is not to say that you shouldn't work nights and weekends. It's really more of a fact of, hey, there are times you might want to make a targeted investment in yourself and your career and even your business to learn a new skill or take on a cool project that doesn't fit within the confines of your day-to-day job. Feel free to work a night and a weekend, because I know that my career advanced quite a bit because I did spend time during certain formative years of my career being in the office every Sunday. And I joke about that with my team, but I used to tell them, yeah, my wife would come in with me. She'd have coffee because I had an office, and I would work on projects, that I could do myself. Then we'd go to lunch and come back. And I'll never forget the first time when I changed jobs. I wasn't going in on Sundays. After the second Sunday, she asked me, "Are you getting fired?" Because she just because my expectation setting is that I was going into the office every Sunday. But again, that was my choice. That wasn't something that my management team expected of me. And I was still getting plenty of recharge time, and I was getting a lot of great learning out of that process. And for me, working on those extra projects was key. So I wanted to just take a moment and say, hey, there's a lot that goes on in this space when it comes down to, should you work weekends? How do you not work weekends? And some of these strategies have really worked for me. And if you made it this far, and if you have any questions, please do put them down in the comments section. I'd be happy to answer them along with any other topics that you might find interesting. So with that, I'd just like to say, hey, thanks for joining today. Again, there are a lot of great tactics for dealing with 24/7 work by managers or as an individual contributor, and I hope this has been helpful to you. So again, I hope everybody does really well and is having a great day, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.